Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd Annual ISNA Education Forum. We're happy to have you. This session is in the curriculum and instruction track, and we have a wonderful presentation for you this morning. Will my children be Muslim? Investigating the influences on youth religiosity. And we have Brother Usman Umarji, and we are going to get started very shortly, but I just want to open up and also give you some information about how we're going to run this session and how long it will be. All right, thank you. First of all, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. We give praise and thanks to Allah for blessing us to be here together today and to continue our work in the education of our children. Inshallah, we will have, we'll be able to answer any of the questions that you have for us today. First, we want to get started. I'm going to make a short dua. Oh Allah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Oh Allah, enrich me with knowledge, grace me with forbearance, honor me with taqwa, and adorn me with peace and security. Amen. Our speaker today is Dr. Usman Umarji. I've been practicing my R. Umarji. So we're going to, I'm going to share with you some information about him. Dr. Usman Umarji holds a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering and a Master's and PhD in Educational Psychology from UC Irvine. He has studied Islam at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. Dr. Umarji is Director of Psycho-Spiritual Research and Data Studies at Yakin Institute for Islamic Research and is an adjunct professor in the School of Education at UC Irvine, where he teaches adolescent development and statistics. He is an active community scholar and speaks in Southern California. His research focuses on the development of human motivation and decision-making, religious socialization, Islamic legal theory, and Islamic legal theory. His expertise in both psychological and Islamic sciences allows him to conduct empirical research on the contemporary issues facing Muslims. We thank you for coming, everyone who's here, and we also thank you, Dr. Umarji, for being with us. You may start.
جزاكم الله خير. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. It is an honor and privilege to be here today to present on a topic which is, I'm sure, very near and dear to all of our hearts and concerning to all of us, which is this big question that is on the hearts and minds of many parents, which is, will my children be Muslim? So inshallah, in this talk, we'll be investigating what we have found through both the Islamic literature and the contemporary literature in the West about what influences youth religiosity. This presentation today is based upon a paper that I had written for the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, and is also part of our ongoing research at Yaqeen. I want to begin by speaking today about putting us in a historical climate. Where are we in America? And this country was founded on, or is heavily dominated by Christian thought and Christian values. And for much of the inception of America until the modern times, the last few decades, Christianity was a dominant faith of this country. Over time, more and more folks have come, or different immigrants, different religions began to populate this country. And I want to just zoom in on just one period of time, which is the last about 5 decades, from the 70s until today, to show what's kind of happening historically and where we fit into this. Around the 70s, from the 70s all the way through pretty much 1991, the rate of, or the prevalence of people in this country who did not ascribe to a particular religion was very, very low. You would find, if you look at this chart, it was always less than about 8%. So less than 8% of Americans would say that they don't identify with a particular religion. And all of a sudden in kind of 1993, if you look until today, you see this. So it was flatlined from 1972 to about 1991. And then all of a sudden from 93 until today, you see this massive linear increase where we went from having about 6 out of 100 to 23% in 2018 of Americans say they don't identify with any particular religion. So what this is telling us is that religion in America is going through a crisis. The rise in atheism is substantial. And Muslims are a part of the fabric of this country. I know for many, many years, especially growing up, I remember when I grew up here, I was born in the early 80s, there was always this notion being put on is that, well, we're different, we're different, we're different. And I've come to realize through the research about Muslims in America is that we actually mirror many of the social trends that are happening to the general population. And so when you see here that almost 1 in 4 Americans do not ascribe to a religion, and then you see actually today, this is data from Pew, that almost 1 in 5 Muslims children who are raised as Muslims do not identify as Muslims in adulthood, which means that our trends are very, very similar, and the same crises of faith that is happening to the American population is happening to the Muslim American population. And so our talk today, we really want to hone in on this question of what is it? What is causing Muslim youth and American youth in general to lose their religious identity? And what are some of the predictors of that? And of course, we know ultimately that Iman is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the one who gives faith to us. But there's also, He has created means. And those means are the things that we need to focus on and say, what is it that will increase the likelihood that we transmit our faith in meaningful ways to our children? A little bit more backdrop around this, just to give you some context, is that Muslims are actually doing much better than other faiths when it comes to transmitting faith. So Catholics are actually the lowest in America. Less than half of Catholic parents transmit their faith to their children. Whereas for Muslims and for Mormons, those numbers are much higher, around the high 70s to around the 80% point. So there's a lot of hope that's within this. I don't want this to be, kind of this doom and gloom, but we still need to recognize that 1 out of 5 is still a substantial number. So today's talk, I want to focus on this notion of particularly honing in on adolescent Islamic identity formation. And when I'm using this term, I want to be very clear what we mean by it. When I talk about identity, I don't simply mean calling yourself a Muslim, although that's part of it. I'm really speaking about 3 components of identity. The first component is what somebody deeply believes about who they are as a person. And adolescence in particular, this is a time, a developmental time, when the primary question that they're out to figure out is, who are they? So if one was to ask, what is adolescence all about? What is that time period between childhood and adulthood? What is that time period that's approximately between the age of 10 and 20? What is that all about? It's about figuring out who we are as people. What do we value? What are our core beliefs? And beyond what we simply believe, it's also about what we do. So what do I do on a day-to-day level? What type of practices do I enact? And those could be practices of the limbs, they could be practices of the heart. And it also has to do with who we hang out with and spend time with, because we don't live in a vacuum. Yes, in the pandemic, many of us have been relegated to our homes for the most part and maybe not interacting with our communities as much, but generally, throughout our lives, is that we enact behavior and beliefs around other people. And so for a strong Islamic identity to form, we need to really inculcate these 3 things in the hearts and the minds of the youth that we deal with. Is that, what do you believe in and who are you as a person? What do you do and who do you do it with? And religiosity in adolescence has been found to be an incredibly important aspect of meaning making and also of adaptive mental health adaptation. So youth who are religious in this country, Muslim and even non-Muslim, they have better mental health, lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicide, less substance abuse and drug abuse. So the benefits of religiosity are not simply realized in the hereafter, which of course is tremendous, but they're also realized in this life. So the big question that one might wonder is, okay, fine, you're saying there's this Islamic identity, but none of us simply have one identity. All of us, from adults, especially to adolescents, we hold all these numerous identities within our minds and our hearts. So people have racial identities. So whether a youth happens to be Black or Arab or South Asian or Hispanic, that identity has a set of cultural assumptions that come with it. I remember my parents would tell me when I was a kid, they said, this is what we do. And what she said was what we do, sometimes she would also refer to what Pakistanis or South Asians do, which is also different than, for instance, what a gender identity might be. So there's things that men do, there's things that women do. And of course, that line today has become extremely blurred in the American liberal context. But people do have gender identities, that they want to do behaviors that capitalize or demonstrate their manliness or that demonstrate their femininity. So choices of colors, choices of clothing, right? Choices of toys to play with, so on and so forth. Then we have, of course, our religious identity, which is the crux of our conversation today. But we also possibly have whether people identify as being a feminist, right? Or people identify as being a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, whether they identify as being a capitalist, whether they identify as being an American. So all of these different identities, they will ultimately, in this period of adolescence, we will figure out, the teenager is going to figure out how do I organize all of these within myself into a system of identity? Because there's something which is most important, then there's that, or I most identify with, and then I slightly less identify with, and all the way down to which I hardly identify with. So to give a few examples of what we might see in a Muslim youth, you might see a Muslim youth who's grappling to understand how do all of these identities fit into who I am. And they, through their experiences in life, through what their parents and their friends and the media and everything else we'll cover today, they come up with this in their mind. So this is just kind of a stacked identity, that the American identity, perhaps this is just a random Muslim. This could be any Aisha or any Muhammad in our community. Says, I am first and foremost an American. And then what really matters to me is that I am an Arab. And then that I'm a female. And then that I'm a Muslim, and then so on and so forth. So what we see in this is that the Islamic identity for this particular adolescent is somewhere in the middle of their hierarchy. And you might have another teenager who says, no, first and foremost, I'm a feminist. And I am, whatever, my racial identity, I'm white. And I'm a female who's a Democrat, and I'm an American who's an aspiring engineer, and then I'm a Muslim at the very end of it. And then you might have a third person who says, no, I really am first and foremost a Muslim. That identity is the most salient thing to me. Then after that, I can be Desi, I can be male or female, and I can be, a doctor or anything else. I'm an American, I'm a Democrat, whatever it might be. But we want to hone in on is, if you notice, where does Islam fall into their hierarchy? And this is really what the core of what society is doing to people, is they're helping them figure out where to put these identities within their system. America doesn't care if people are Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or anything else. Just don't let that dominate how you see the world, right? Generally, we want people to be, at least from the economic perspective, they want to inculcate capitalists. They want to inculcate loyal patriots, right? People with a national identity. And as long as that supersedes everything else, then we consider that to be a well-socialized person. Now, where does all of this come from? One of the ways that we can conceptualize how we transmit values to the adolescent is by thinking about the different environments that an adolescent lives in. We all live within some sort of a household around a family. So that's the most proximal, tight-knit, influential aspect. So that's this kind of orange circle on the screen. And then families that live in a home, they live in a neighborhood. We live on a street, we live on a block, we live in a certain zip code or county, and that neighborhood has schools, it has parks, it has libraries, it has certain neighbors, who have certain ways of seeing the world. And then that neighborhood resides within a county, a city, a state, a country that has its own values and beliefs and practices at every single level. So what religious socialization is about, or all socialization actually, is about how do each of these influencers, you can call a socializer, another term we can use an influencer. How is that influencer, that can be a parent, a sibling, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend, an imam, how do all of these people pass down specific beliefs, values, and behaviors that the adolescent will form an identity out of, and they will begin to enact in their own life? And we're going to start our talk today with the most important of all of these socializers, and that is the parent. Where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that no child is born, but that he is upon the natural disposition, the fitrah, to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thereafter, it is one's parents that would then make him or her a Christian, a Jew, or a Magian. So what this hadith gets at is something that modern social science has found overwhelming empirical evidence through study after study after study, following Americans over decades, whether they were Christian, whether they were Jewish, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Hindu, no matter what faith they practice, the most powerful influencer and source of socialization is the family. It is the parents. Youth that are raised in religious families are going to be far more religious than youth raised in non-religious families. And I love this quote that was given by Christian Smith, who was kind of the architect around the largest study of youth religiosity in America. It's called the National Study of Youth and Religion. He said that parents have only one good and hopefully effective way to raise children to understand and carry on their family's religion. And he said that is for parents simply to practice their own personal faith naturally for its own sake and as role models for their children. And so while we get this, that okay, parents matter, the big question is, how do parents matter? What is it that parents do? And I want to pick just a number of things that have been found to be the most prevalent aspects of parental socialization. The first and foremost is what is termed spiritual role modeling. And just like all of us parents and all people who are in positions of power want to find role models for those who are underneath them. So, if I love basketball, I want my kid to have the best role model for basketball, whether that be somebody in the local community, right? Whether even it be you watch videos of LeBron James and of Kobe Bryant and you model your game after them. The point is we try to find role models for every domain of life. Maybe if you want your kid to be a doctor, you say, let me find a doctor in the neighborhood that kid can learn from, can maybe even shadow. And so the parents ultimately are the first and most important spiritual role model in the lives of youth. Because adolescents and because children spend the most time with their parents in their early stages of development, it is absolutely essential that parents enact those behaviors at home to give the children a lived experience as to what does it mean to be religious. So parents praying, parents reading Quran, parents living by a certain set of values, parents frequenting Islamic spaces. Those are the things that are the most important aspects of parental socialization. The second aspect that comes into play is parental motivation and encouragement. And I'll go into some of this in more detail in the upcoming slides. What I mean by this is that parents who not only believe in practicing the faith for themselves, but who are actually actively encouraging and motivating their youth towards making religious choices. I'll give you some subtle examples that come up all the time. In my work as an imam, in my work as someone who designed and consulted for Sunday schools for years, as someone who's been working with adolescents over the last decade plus, one of the biggest challenges that teenagers are facing today is that they talk about the mixed signals they get from their parents. That you see many young children who are maybe 7, 8, 9 years old, their parents will tell them, you need to pray, you need to go to Sunday school, you need to go and read these Islamic books. And they'll do their best to put their kids in those spaces. But what they'll say is when their kids get to adolescence, especially late adolescence, the last few years of high school, early years of college, the children pick up on that my mom and dad actually have told me not to spend too much time with the MSA. They have told me not to spend too much time with that other religious stuff because I need to focus on college. I need to focus on academics. I need to focus on the extracurricular that's going to get me into the elite university. So how parents motivate their kids or actually demotivate their kids is a huge part of what children will pick up. And it's very, very subtle. It doesn't even have to be with words. It can be through subtle cues of behavior. I'll give you another example of that. If a child comes home from school and they bring a C home to their parents on their math test, if a parent gets very angry and upset that, man, how do you bring home a C? That is something which we don't tolerate in this house. Well, the child gets a signal that mathematics and secular education really, really, really matter. But if they come home from youth group or Sunday school or some other religious experience, and you know what, I didn't do my Quran homework, I didn't do my Islamic studies, I didn't even show up, and the parents just don't really say anything, then the child gets the cue that this is not what's really valued. Math and science and English matter. Quran and Islamic studies are really not that important to my parents. And then you get to another aspect of it, which is parent-child coactivity. That it's simply beyond parents doing things themselves, which is maybe praying in their own house, reading Quran, or going to the masjid, but also it's do the parents and children do religious activities together. And this is where you hear stories about, I hear youth tell me sometimes that my mom, when she goes to pray, she prays 5 times a day, but she goes into her room and she closes the door and she does her prayer. And so the child will say, my mom never prays with me, or the dad never prays with me because my dad is at work all day long. So are the parents recognizing the importance of this coactivity, that the parent sits down and says, let's read Quran together, right? Let's do prophet stories together with my children, and even with my teenager if I have to, right? Let's talk about religious issues together, right? Let's go to the masjid and for tarawih together, or for iftar together, or any other event. But we're doing these things together as a family because we're showing this is what we truly value. We don't just value going to the park as a family. We don't just value going to soccer practice. We actually value doing religious activities together as well. And then another aspect of that is very, very related is parents have the ability to provide their children with religious resources and experiences. And again, I'll speak more about this later, but it's something which really pains my heart is that I see parents who love to buy religious literature for their children. And they will buy every religious book that comes out when the kid is 5, when the kid is 6, when the kid is 7. So the parents go and they get Curious George and Ramadan, right? They go and they buy all these cool religious books, and they buy their blocks, and they buy, they'll subscribe to a video or anything else. And they provide all that religious resources for the young children. And as the kids get older, you see all that dry up and you see it disappear. That, once a kid is 10, 11, 12 years old, all the expenditures go into what really, really matters oftentimes to parents, which might be, and again, I'm not here to blame the parents, but it's a subtle thing that in their mind, they're thinking, I want the best dunya for my child. And it goes into academic stuff. It goes into extracurricular things. It goes into the sports. And then the religious experiences diminish, right? The religious resources, they diminish. So parents have a role in providing those experiences, either enrolling them in camps, taking them to classes, taking them to, if they have the opportunity to go to places like Umrah, right, or to go to visit religious sites all over the world. And these are all parts of what parents can do to transmit these values. And it's about the diversity of all of these, that the parent does it, they encourage the kid to do it, they do it together, they provide those resources. But, and here's a huge but to all of this, none of this will have a serious impact unless there is a healthy parent-child relationship. And I cannot stress this enough. I'll repeat it again. None of what I've just mentioned matters. You can pray, and parents can pray, and they can read Quran, and they can encourage their kids, and they can drag their kids wherever they go, and they can buy them this and enroll them in that. None of it will matter if there is not a healthy parent-child relationship. So this is actually the most important lever by which you unlock the child's religious potential, by which you unlock the ability to inculcate and to absorb the religious identity. How does this occur? It occurs first and foremost through a strong parental attachment. And what I mean by a parental attachment is that a child learns from a young age that I feel very secure around mom and dad. I feel very close to them emotionally, that if I need something in life, I can go to them. When I'm in their presence, I feel safe. And if I need to venture and explore, I know I can always run back to my parents when I need help. And parental attachment, as we're doing some ongoing research, is what we believe, and what the Quran actually indicates, is that children actually form a conceptual model of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. They form their image of Allah, and they form their attachment to Allah dependent on the attachment to the parents. This is key. This is why Allah actually calls the parents in the Quran, where Allah says, Allah says, oh, Allah have mercy upon my parents, kama rabbayani saghira. Like my parents were in the position of a Lord, is literally what the word means, right? By which they nurtured me when I was young. So if the parent creates this relationship of love, of mercy, of gentleness, of warmth, of compassion, and then they're speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the child will see that, well, God must be like my parents in terms of those attributes. And so if a parent is harsh, and if a parent is punishing, and if a parent is cold, then the child will internalize that must be what my Lord is like as well. And so in our actual data we've collected, we actually have found this. We have found that a lot of Muslim youth, teenagers and young college students, have a very negative image of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not because they don't believe that He is Ar-Rahman. They believe that, but their experience with their parents has been such otherwise that they then attribute that my lived experience with Allah is I view Him as someone who is cold and distant, not as one who is near. So what can parents do beyond simply having that warm relationship, which is a foundation, right, of anything you do? So if we want someone to imitate a behavior of somebody, the person has to have love for that person. So when we find our youth, when I was young, I used to want to imitate someone like Michael Jordan, right? I want to get the shirts that he had, the shoes that he had. I want to play basketball like him. It's because there was some love that developed between me and this individual who I don't even know, but I looked up to him. So whatever he wore, I wanted to wear. It's actually very irrational. His ability to be a good basketball player has nothing to do with what he wears. But this is how the human being operates. The one that we love, we want to imitate. So if we want our children to imitate our religious behavior, then they have to love us first and foremost. If there's no love, there will not be that imitation. So frequency of conversation is the next part that really, really matters. There has been massive studies about this that have looked at hundreds of Muslim youth across, not Muslim youth, hundreds of American youth, including Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. And all of these studies come back to saying that frequency of religious conversations within American youth are varied. They say about a third say they have almost no religious conversations with their parents. About a third say they have some infrequent conversations, and about a third say they have somewhat regular religious conversations. So if the conversations don't exist and they're very, very minimal, one should not expect that religious values will be transmitted. But it's not simply the frequency that matters. That's just one component. The other component that's far more important is the quality of those conversations. So in fact, the research has found that just talking to your kids about religion, lecturing your kids, and it being one directional, where I sit my kid down all the time and say, this is what you have to believe, this is what you have to do, and you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you have to do this. And it's a list of of rules and of do's and don'ts. That actually has been found not to be the most beneficial for the child to absorb the religious values. What has been found to be beneficial is to have a bidirectional conversation. So when children feel that I'm emotionally close enough to my mom and my dad that I can ask a question, and I can ask a question and I won't get berated for it. You know, there used to be a time, where Muslim youth, I remember kids that I'd speak to, they would never dare ask their parents, like, why do we have to do this? Or why do we have to do that? Because the question of asking why was something which would get the irk and the ire of the parents. It's like, don't ask me why, just do it. And so what we have found in the literature and in the Quran, as I'll share the verse, is that when the child feels and the parent allows for that, to say, you know what, I know that my teenager might be going through a lot of things today. My teenager is probably being exposed to peers who are involved in all kinds of behaviors and beliefs that we don't hold, whether it be about gender interaction, whether it be about usage of alcohol and drugs, whether it be about anything else in life. Do I even open that door with my child and say, hey, what's going on? And do you feel comfortable speaking to your kids? And do the kids feel comfortable then opening up and saying, yeah, mom, it's true at school. A lot of kids are talking about the dance, they're talking about prom, and this is and that. And there's kids who want to drink, and sometimes I feel peer pressure and I'm invited to these parties. If that conversation is swept under the rug and it just does not exist, right, then the child will never be able to get kind of that value from the parents is how do I grapple the challenges that I face as a Muslim youth in America? And then the proof of this, subhanAllah, is a very powerful statement in the Quran, which is when Prophet Ibrahim and Ismail were actually dealing with a very serious affair. This is when Allah says, I'll quote the verse, and when he, Ismail, reached the age of maturity. So Allah's telling us here, look, when Ismail was an adolescent, Ibrahim said to him, oh, my son, indeed, I have seen in a dream that I should sacrifice you. And look at his words. He said, so what do you think? Now, if you really, really unpack this verse, this was Ibrahim understood this is a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was actually not a negotiable thing, but he wanted it to be something which he and his son could have a conversation about, to include his son in the decision-making process. And he said, so what do you think? And his son responded, oh, my father, do as you are commanded. You will find me, if Allah wills, of the steadfast. Now, what I want to highlight here is that there's a big difference between telling your kid this is what we're going to do and having your child endorse that as well. Hey, what do you think about let's go do this together? And it's almost the exact same outcome that you might get at. But when the person feels a sense of autonomy, the behavior is intrinsically driven, then the enactment of it is so much more meaningful. And you think about that with anything any of us do in life. Do you feel more inclined to enact a behavior with ihsan when someone tells you, hey, you got to do this? Or do you feel more passionate about doing it when it's something which you have derived yourself? Like, I want to do this behavior. And so parents, ultimately, they're the ones who matter the most. And amongst parents, I want to make a few other points that are subtle, but that are important. That interfaith marriages, unfortunately, in America do not lead to religious children. 1 out of 4 interfaith marriages lead to kids who have either of the parents' faith. So very, very bluntly, when Muslims marry non-Muslims, the general rule, as it is in America, is those kids will not have a strong religious identity. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, but that's the general rule. The other big finding is that divorce has been heavily linked to reduced religiosity and even leaving the religion of parents. And that's maybe a conversation for the Q&A later if we need to. The second socializer I want to bring into this are peers. As the Prophet Muhammad said, a beautiful hadith, he said the parable for the influence of a righteous friend compared to a bad friend is the example of a perfume seller and a blacksmith. As for the perfume seller, you will either buy perfume from him or benefit from the good smell he exudes, whereas a blacksmith will either burn you or your clothes, or the foul smell will rub off on you. And so what we find in the literature, Islamic literature and the contemporary literature, is that as adolescents begin to grow, they begin to seek the influence of peers substantially more. It's a developmental phenomenon in the West. So whereas parents between the age of 0 and 10 had a massive influence, who, they were the primary socializers, the kids would defer to what the parents believe and want almost all the time. As kids hit middle school and high school, parents will become less and less of an influencer. Now, I'm not saying they won't have an influence. It's still a major influence, but the amount of desire for the teen to be around their peers and those values to rub off is substantial. How does this happen? It happens through value transmission in all kinds of settings. And so the Muslim parent or the Muslim educator, the imam, the teacher, all have to be aware of how does this function. And it functions through the frequency of interactions with one's peers. So if our children are at soccer 4 or 5 days a week, and they're having these intimate bonds, right? Sports in particular have this ability to transcend the activity. And it's something about being almost in battle, in competition with a group of people, that you're on a team, that builds a very strong sense of camaraderie. That day after day after day, you're going to interact with your soccer peers. You're going to talk about not just soccer, you're going to talk about, the movies, you're going to talk about, relationships, you're going to talk about all kinds of things in life. And so through those experiences, values will be transmitted. Through deep classwork, through projects at school, in middle school and high school, when there's a lot more focus on collaborative learning, they're going to exchange these ideas. If they're in Muslim spaces, if they're in youth groups, if they're in youth camps, they'll be engaged in all of these ideas. And in terms of religious ideas. And one of the most the shocking findings is that youth who spend time with less religious peers are at an increased risk in adolescence of substance abuse and of alcohol abuse. And even the literature on Muslim college students points to a relatively high usage of trying marijuana and alcohol in early college years, so the ages of 18 and 19. And so I want to really highlight peers by just one example. And when I think about the influence of peers, it's often not simply what the youth believes, but it's about the desire to act in accordance with what the majority of their peers are doing. So then I think about a scenario that I lived, and I'm sure many of us have lived in our kids, is that imagine our kids, they go and they hang out, our teenagers, they go and they spend a Friday night, with their friends. And there's the exact same activity. Activity A, or scenario A, is with their non-Muslim friends. They go to a friend's house and they go and they watch a movie. And so think about this Muslim teenager who goes to their friend's house to watch a movie on a Friday night and Maghrib hits. How difficult would it be for the Muslim youth to be like, hey, everybody, I'm going to step aside from the conversation, from the meal, from the movie, because I need to go and do Maghrib Salah. That's a very tough thing for a Muslim youth to do. Even if they wanted to pray, even if they valued Salah, just the gravity of the situation of what everyone else is doing and the desire to act similar to what my peers are doing would make the likelihood of that person praying substantially lower than if the exact same scenario played out, but it was Muslim friends that were hanging out together. So the Muslim friends are all together on a Friday night and they're having dinner and then they're going to watch a movie. At that point, it becomes very much easier to say, you know what, we can stop for Maghrib. Let's put the movie on pause and we'll all go pray Maghrib. Or before we turn the movie on, we'll finish dinner and we'll go pray Maghrib. So it's not just what the child believes. They both believe, in both scenarios, they believe that they should get up and pray. But do they have the willpower to get up and pray? And so one of the things that I really, really advocate is that we cannot expect our kids to be in fitna. And when I say in fitna, not really in this overt, like negative environment, but in an environment where they have to really just persevere and exercise massive self-control to practice Islam and expect it to enact over and over and over. Self-control is like a muscle. it fatigues. And eventually it's like, I just can't be different constantly. I can't always look different. I can't always speak different. I can't always act different. And thus you will see the shedding of religious practices slowly when they're in that environment. Whereas if they don't have to enact it too often, yeah, of course we have Muslim coworkers, we have Muslim friends, we have Muslim colleagues, but the interactions are not so dominant where, yeah, once in a while, I have no problem getting up and praying when I'm with my non-Muslim friends. I have no problem saying something that's different. But every day, every week, for 365 days a year, it becomes tiring. So we then move from peers. I want to wrap this up in about 10 minutes to give a lot of time for Q&A, mass media. And with today's advent, of course, of the smartphone, there's another, I believe, another session on, but it really has opened up the exposure of mass media to our youth. The average teenager today has a smartphone. Most of the kids have their own laptops, phones, internet access is accessible 24 hours a day. And what we're finding, the literature on youth religiosity, is that exposure to rated R movies, exposure to adult content and violent video games, all of these collectively have been shown empirically that if you have a 13, 14-year-old who's doing these things, exposed to pornography, exposed to watching rated R movies, when they're older in teenagers, that they will actually say that religion is less important to me, and they'll attend religious activities far less. And so these just get us some indicator. We have to be very conscious and cautious around what we allow our kids to actually look at. My personal recommendation is that nobody should have a smartphone below the age of 16. If your kid needs to have a phone, get them a flip phone. It's not the coolest thing, but it's going to be what the need is, which is to contact parents, perhaps to contact people. But opening your kid up to a smartphone at a young age, early adolescence, where their brain is developing still, they're actually at a heightened risk. So adolescent brains are seeking actually risky activities because their brain is wanting to seek rewards. And it is a heightened sensitivity to rewards, which is why teenagers do things that we adults would consider to be crazy. It's not because the kids are crazy. I want to make that very clear. It's because their brain is actually going through a phase of development where it is actually seeking that reward. And so you get thrills out of jumping off of, bungee jumping, right? And doing all kinds of activities that we would say that that's not safe. And so even things like risky taking, like trying a cigarette, trying alcohol, looking at content that might be, forbidden, that's all part of the reward circuitry. That's all part of what adolescents are craving and seeking. So parents have to be very mindful of it and say, I will not allow, you wouldn't give your 3-year-old fire and say, well, he's going to have to learn how to play with fire, right? He'll burn himself at the age of 3. The same thing, a teenager will burn themselves badly spiritually if we give them unbridled access, right, to these technologies. The other thing that has been shown to be really detrimental to youth religiosity is exposure to Islamophobic content. And I think this is tricky because a lot of the discourse in our communities is about raising awareness actually about Islamophobia so we can combat and fight it. But unfortunately for youth in particular who are forming their identity, when they see images about anti-Islamic rhetoric, they see the news media, right? They see billboards, when they see anything that signals that society does not value and respect Muslims, that actually they internalize and say, I don't want to enact that part of my identity because it is not valued in society, which is actually the adaptive thing to do. It really is. If the society says, we don't like this, right? We don't want this, then the natural response for a human being is to say, I will not demonstrate that. And so we have to be very conscious about how much we expose our children to anti-Islamic rhetoric, because they will actually end up then reducing their religiosity in order to fit into society. And then we get to schooling and higher ed, and to be aware that especially if our kids are in a public school, and even if they're in an Islamic school, to be honest, that through the curriculum, through the teachers, through the mission statement of the school, and through the other parents in the school, values are transmitted constantly. The curriculum always favors a certain type of knowledge. If you think about your kids learning, for instance, biology in 10th grade, what is privileged as a worldview of where human beings came from an evolutionary standpoint. Think about teachers and what teachers hold deeply. One of the things that astounds me, as my graduate work was in education, and you think about what is the core curriculum about in public schools. And yes, there's math and there's science, there's all this, but it astounds me how much of it is about cultural transmission. When your kids start school in September or in August, right? Within a month, they hit October and they're learning a whole lot about Halloween. I have one child who's in public school, I have one child who's homeschooled, and I have two that are too young for, who are not in school yet. And I see the stark difference. My son in public school comes home, it's like worksheet after worksheet in October about Halloween. And, he's drawing, pumpkins and carving out, witches and all these other type of things. And then I go to November and I'm like, the kid is spending a month of arts and crafts and activities and spelling assignments and math assignments where he's adding up turkeys and he's doing all these things to do with Thanksgiving. And then December, he gets Christmas, and then so on and so forth. February, he gets Valentine's Day. March, he got St. Patrick's Day. And so it's like, well, they're absorbing the American mindset and they're becoming citizens of America. But those values, there's a lot of things within that is very, very difficult and tricky to deal with. So we need to be aware of the role of schools, which gets me then to the role of higher education in particular. Higher ed, which I mean college, has been found to be a really tricky place for religious identity development. And the reason why it's so tricky is that the notion out there is that what is happening in higher ed is that they're pushing. So number one, professors tend not to be very religious, right? As someone who is, who teaches in the university setting, talking about religion amongst my peers is very challenging. And I actually do, and I do very openly speak about it. And they'll sometimes ping me, that fellow professors say, I'd love to sit down with you and talk about your religious ideas, kind of one-on-one, because it's something which is not talked about, right, in the public discourse of academia. So professors, there's studies that show they're less religious than the general population. And so universities are constantly exposing our youth to secular philosophies, right? If you go, colleges are generally on the liberal side, not on the conservative side. So like liberalism is the dominant discourse, secularism, right? Feminine ideas, right? These are the things that dominate the discourse of higher ed. And the promotion of scientism in particular. And in higher ed 150 years ago, even at Harvard University, the mandate of the university, a lot of it was to do with character and the inculcation of even religious values, because they thought that this was a way to live a wholesome life. But over the last century, this has been practically eliminated from every single university. And what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes a valid tool of arriving at knowledge is only that which has been come about through scientific inquiry, which is really, really problematic for youth who are coming to the university saying, we believe in revelation, right? We believe in angels, right? We believe, right, in supernatural entities. And that is why, unfortunately, religious beliefs, they've been found not to just, people don't like abandon their faith in college, but what they do is they re-examine and they incorporate other ways of seeing the world into their faith. So they say, well, I can be a Muslim who's also a feminist. I can be a Muslim who's also a capitalist. I'm a Muslim who's also, who's liberal. And I say liberal meaning from a philosophical standpoint, not from a political standpoint. And thus they find that youth in college, without abandoning their faith, they stop believing or less confidence and conviction in that which is supernatural. So for us as Muslims, ilm al-ghaib, knowledge of the unseen, is a huge part of this. And they actually consider that too. They're not as confident and put much value and stock in the existence of angels, existence of the day of judgment, existence in jinn, and these other entities that are considered to be outside the domain of science. And so I want to advocate here that the role of clubs is really, really important in helping or harming religious identity. If youth enroll in fraternities and other clubs that could be very detrimental to faith versus enrolling in MSAs that can be very adaptive and helpful. So thinking about the environment that we allow our kids to, where our kids should go to college. I'm not advocating they don't, but when they go to college, do we set up the environment of who they live with and what clubs they join that can hopefully keep their faith strong? I'm gonna wrap it up in 2 minutes. I'm gonna say a couple of things. One, I don't have time for all this, is my concern is the way that we teach Islam in many ways today. I'm gonna quickly go because I literally have 2 minutes. I'll give this analogy, is that the way that we pass Islam on to our youth often is in the form of just facts. So whether they go to Sunday school, whether they're given a book, oftentimes it's just facts. I want to give a really, I think, a simple analogy that demonstrates what I mean by this, is that you think about the game of football. Football is a very complex sport, just like, I mean, you can substitute basketball or anything else out. Now, when someone watches football, how many judgments are made while you watch? People have to watch the ball, but you also have to watch the other players, and there's a whole lot of players, so which players are you watching? And none of us would assume that through simply studying books on football and strategy of football, that somehow someone become a competent football player. So one can never become, a good at football without ever watching it, and not just watching it, but also it's not about simply knowing the rules, but about understanding how to make judgments about the game itself. And so what I wanted to get at here, it's like learning what matters is what truly matters. So I don't want us to get lost in simply the transmission of information. And so just passing down facts that Islam says, do this and do that and believe in this and believe in that, and that's the corpus of Islamic knowledge, is not really what is going to inculcate the identity that matters. What they want to know is, why does any of that matter? What is the importance of what we believe in? What's the importance of what we do? And if I had to come up with an analogy for this, I use this analogy. This is an image that I'm showing you right now. This is a zoomed in image. And any image from a camera is made of millions of pixels. And each pixel is inherently meaningless, right? That top left pixel that's kind of a light green, right? It's meaningless to us as human beings because we're passive to just information. We need some sort of sense making. And so my fear is that how Islam is often taught in our settings today is simply teaching them pixel by pixel by pixel. Here's a hadith, here's an ayah, here's an idea, here's a belief, here's a fact, and it's just this concoction of pixels. But do our children ever see Islam as this? And this flower is created of millions of pixels. But you have to be able to zoom out and teach the child from a big picture perspective. Why does any of this matter? How does it matter? How do these facts fit into the way that we see the world? How do they benefit us on a day-to-day basis? Why are they important? And if that occurs, then you will see the identity solidify. And to give the analog, we've all learned countless facts in school. We learned math, we learned science, we learned history. All those facts are meaningless to most of us now because they were abstract facts that did not coalesce in some sort of a meaningful process of determining why any of that really mattered. And so the last thing I'm going to say before we end is to invest in youth in this adolescent phase. So much of our Muslim community's efforts, whether it be with books, whether it be with media, whether it be with schools, focuses on the younger ages, which is fine and important. But we have to have a paradigm shift where we see that the teenage years, the adolescent years are the most pivotal for religious identity development. And if we do not create for them the proper books, the proper camps, the proper places for them to enact their faith in a meaningful way, and they're only spending their time in AP classes and extracurricular sports, then we should not be surprised that when they're forming their identity, if the Islamic identity drops to the bottom of that hierarchy. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make our youth and our spouses from the coolness of our eyes and to make them leaders of this ummah. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Thank you, Brother Usman. We really appreciate that presentation. We'll now open up for questions. We have several questions in the chat. And if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask that question, I will, you may do that. I do have the questions and I can ask them for you. It's left up to you.
I have the questions, but we want to just go one by one. But why don't you go ahead and read me a question at a time? We'll do it like that.
Okay. Okay, so the first question was, Salam, what should we do when students get dropped off to Islamic schools and parents don't keep up at home? I teach fifth grade, the core classes. Some of my students only pray at school. Some don't even know the Shahada or what to say during Salah. How can we help them fall in love with Islam when parents don't care?
Jazakumullah khair. That's probably the best question that we could talk about for an hour, but to try to be concise and short, this goes back to what I spoke about. It's all these nested environments are what we all grow up in. So it's the family, it's the school, right? It's the masjid, it's the community. And all of us have to be pushing each other. So the parents have to influence the schools in a positive way. The schools have to influence parents. My advice, and I remember I did this when I was running a Sunday school, was to actually find some way of mandating and simultaneously holding parental education while the kids are also in those settings. So is there a way that, and by the way, many schools do this, private schools do it. I've seen any non-Muslim private schools that do this, which they actually mandate that parents attend a certain amount of workshops, attend a certain amount of activities, because we're also trying to socialize the parents. And to be very honest, many of these parents, they're sincere. Like they themselves say, unfortunately, I did not grow up religious. I don't know much about my religion. I don't really even know how to pray very well. Like my model of religion is so bad. I don't want to pass that down to my kids. Let me outsource it. So the niyyah is really, really good. Now, just because the niyyah is good doesn't mean the results are going to be great, right? Those kids are going to go and say, well, my parents don't do any of this stuff. My parents matter more at the end of the day than what I'm getting in school. And so they probably will not enact it. So in this case, the school needs to be aware of this and say, do I have a pulse on my parents? Who are they? What do they believe in? And can I simultaneously hold activities, workshops, within a PTA, within camps, within other spaces to actually allow parents to grow while their kids grow, and actually tell this to the parents. I mean, I bluntly tell parents that, look, you're spending $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month on your kids' Islamic education. I'm telling you, it's a wasted investment unless you can do some of these things yourself at home. So save that money and be a better Muslim yourself, and you'll be in a better place. So how do we do that? It's by those things. Okay. I say, all parents, you have to be enrolled in something. I remember I did this actually as a teacher. I actually made, as a consultant of the school, I made every teacher in a Sunday school, who, by the way, I don't want to ever assume that Sunday school teachers also have a tremendous amount of knowledge, because they're just like many of the regular parents. They're sincere and trying to help. So every stakeholder has to be getting education. The teacher has to be getting continuous education, and the parent has to be getting continuous education. The parent also needs to learn not just religious education, but about the stages of development. So many parents say, I don't understand my teenager. You need to understand, what is a teenager going through psychologically? What are they going through physiologically? Because then that prevents a lot of the conflicts. When parents come and tell me, like, my kid doesn't listen to me, my kid does a whole bunch of ridiculous things, my kid is stubborn, my kid does all kinds of risk-taking behaviors, I tell them, they're not doing this to spite you. They're doing this as a normative part of how their brain is developing. And you need to understand that. And you need to know how to channel them in the right direction. So my answer is simply inculcating parental education. Wallahu alam.
Alhamdulillah, great answer. There's a school in Tampa, Sister Magda's school, Bayan Academy. I remember that she would have, I'm not sure if she's still doing it now, but she would have sessions for parents every month. There will be a workshop for parents. It's called it Tarbiyah, and the parents had to attend. So great answer. I definitely agree with that.
Patricia, can I add something?
Sure. Oh, hi. Hi, sorry, Dr. Sima.
I love the answer, but I want to say this one thing. First of all, I'm Seema. My mom have long experience in Sunday school and regular schools, but I would add to what you said that get busy with that child. You can have a tremendous impact on that child. I have seen some children go home and convince their parents to dress differently, or to do, prayer with them, and sometimes coming from the child, it's harder to refuse than it would be from you or I. That's just an experience that I'm so grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me.
Absolutely.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Dr. Seema. Question, how does the American curriculum for English literature affect youth religiosity? Shouldn't Islamic schools choose books that emphasize Islamic values and not topics like adultery and relationships between genders?
Yeah, Jazakumullah khair. That's another great question. I'm not very politically correct, so excuse me. I don't think I think our Islamic schools are often Muslim schools. And I say that bluntly. Many of our Islamic schools are Muslim schools. They're schools that Muslims attend. There's nothing Islamic about them. And what I mean by that is that in order to have a truly Islamic school, you actually have to have an entire vision of what it means to actually have Islam permeate into all the subjects we teach. To have math, science, English, and then a separate period for Islamic studies is no different than just putting your kid in a public school and then saying, after school, I'm going to put you in an Islamic studies class. So being very upfront about that. So now if you're in an English literature class, yes, of course, just assigning the same textbooks and the books that are given in the public school will not achieve what we want. But here's the dilemma that I'm sympathizing and don't want to criticize the schools for. They don't have many good choices. I would like, if someone knows in the chat, I personally do not know of any good literature for Muslim high schoolers, especially, that can rival the quality of literature you're going to get from non-Muslims. So I'll give this example. Like all of our kids who read, I have an 11-year-old, she can read 100 books like in like a 2-week span, right? She'll just go to the library, you fill it all up. And like, how do I even pick 2 or 3 Islamic books? Again, this is maybe like a personal plug for myself. I've tried to enter into the space. I've tried to write a novel about the life of Prophet Suleiman as an attempt to create authentic American Islamic literature. And there's little attempts like this. But again, we talk about where do we need to start to invest resources? It's in stuff like this. Because look, let's be blunt. Why would a kid want to read an Islamic book that's been translated in terrible English or it's culturally irrelevant relative to reading the Hunger Games or relative to reading Lord of the Rings or Mark Twain or any of these other authors that are very, very prolific and enjoyable? So the onus comes on us as a community to say that's a gap that we can't put it on a school or a teacher because there's no resource. And so I agree, yes, we need to filter better. We need to be very cognizant of not admitting things that into our curriculum that are really detrimental. But at the same time, we've got to fill that void in the next few years with investing in like some serious curriculum development. So it's not a great answer, but it's the most honest that I have, Allahu Alam.
And honesty is the best way to approach that, because we do not have the books, and we do need curriculum. We do need books. We talk about having an Islamic curriculum, but we also do not have the books to. You have to, in order to have a curriculum.
Yeah.
So we need to get busy in writing our own textbooks. However, in the meantime, we also need to have to see how we can incorporate Islamic values or point out Islamic values or the lack of Islamic values in the texts that we do have.
Absolutely.
So that is, we can't wait. The more we know, the better we are able to help our students see those Islamic values and principles that are in the literature that they are reading.
Absolutely. And I'll add one more thing to that. So this also goes into not just creating books, but honestly, creating real Islamic teachers. Again, I want to differentiate that from Muslim teachers. Many of our wonderful Muslims go into teaching profession and they get a teaching credential and they go and they teach in Islamic schools. That doesn't make you an Islamic teacher. That makes you a Muslim teacher. I'll be very honest. When I go look for a doctor, I don't just look at whether he's Muslim or not, right? Being a Muslim physician or a Muslim engineer or Muslim accountant doesn't make you better at that craft in and of itself, right? So do we have programs to take an English teacher, say, you know what, you are going to teach Mark Twain because that's American literature, but this is how this is where you need to understand Islamic concepts, where you need to pull out this as being un-Islamic and teach your kids this. So that's another level of development that I think national organizations have to get involved with, a true teacher academy that is rooted in Islam.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that answer. The next question is, what is the steps we should do? What is the steps? We should do it now okay, what are the steps? What are the steps? We should do it now to strengthen the Muslim identity, especially in the school. What steps should we be taken to strengthen Muslim identity in Muslim schools?
In Muslim schools in particular? Well, I think it's what we've meant. Well, I guess we can do it in 2 ways. So number one is most kids are not in Muslim schools, right? We need to be very clear about that. 90% are in public schools. So we cannot ignore, I believe that it's a mistake to put all of our eggs in developing Islamic schools, because that's just not going to be a viable option for the vast majority of youth in America, either due to financial resources, either due to the just prevalence of schools. So we have to simultaneously think about, what do we do with kids who go to public school? Do we have programs that are after school programs, where if a kid went, let's say, from 8 to 2:30, that's a serious dose of secular education. And to think that the hour on Sunday or the 2 hours or the 3 hours is going to suffice, that it makes no sense to think that. So what do you do in that interim? What type of supplemental after school education can you get? How do communities develop that? I think that has to be a huge point of investment. So maybe a masjid says, or even maybe even an Islamic school in the community that's got 10% of the Muslim youth and 90% are in public school, say, look, you guys who go to public school, that's fine. Come after school, and we've got something to help you inculcate at least those basics that you have to get. And the Islamic school, maybe we can deal with that, at another point, because I think we're at the time. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we are out of time. Thank you, everyone, for attending this evaluation form that you will fill out for this session. And we give praise and thanks to Allah for blessing us and guiding us. And we pray that you will continue to stick with us for the rest of the day for the other presentations. and tomorrow on Sunday for their other presentations. Thank you, Brother Dr. Usman, and we really appreciate your work that you're doing. And I've gotten a lot out of the session. You really made some very, very important points about what we should be doing and how we should do it. Thank you so much. Anything else, Dr. Usman, would you like to say?
No, Jazakallah khair. It was really an honor and privilege. I hope that we can always continue this conversation. I did just put in the chat the name of the book. So people want to see an attempt at creating Islamic literature for Muslim youth. It was a book that was written for about 10-year-olds and up. So I hope that it inspires others to take on this mantle and to begin to create authentic content for our youth. So Jazakallah khair. It was an honor and privilege. May Allah guide all of our youth. May Allah protect us all. At the end of the day, we do everything in our power to guide our youth, but it's in the hands of Allah. So abundance of dua that we make, we cry in the middle of the night, right? That is what's going to have the biggest impact, in addition to, of course, the worldly things that we can do. So Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.